The morning the town came to watch a woman die. The sky over Red Hollow was a flat, washed-out gray, and the air had that cold, thin bite that made rope fibers feel even rougher against skin. And Lena stood on the trapdoor with her bare toes curled over the splintered edge like that thin board was the last thing keeping her from sliding off the world. Hands tied behind her, chin forced up by the noose that already hugged the bruised skin of her throat, while the crowd below her shifted and breathed and pretended they weren't there to see if her neck would snap clean or if she would kick and dance for a while first. The preacher stood to her left with his little black book open in stiff fingers, his voice already moving automatically through the same phrases he had spoken for every condemned soul in the county, while the sheriff kept to the right, one hand on the rail, eyes not quite willing to rest on her face for more than a heartbeat at a time. And behind them, at a small table, Judge Harlan Cole read from a sheet of paper that rattled faintly in the faint breeze as if even the paper was nervous. "Mara Collins," he said in that dry, official voice that had sent men to prison, to mines, to unmarked graves, found guilty by a jury of your peers of payroll robbery resulting in the death of Deputy Marshal Reed Carver, and of conspiring with known bandits to disrupt lawful railroad operations in this territory. The words felt like they were being nailed into the day, one by one. And when he lifted his head, his pale eyes flicked over her as if she were already a memory, something written down and put away. Below, the crowd pressed closer to the rope's shadow. Women in shawls and faded dresses, men in work shirts and dust-streaked coats, ranch hands with spurs that jingled when they shifted, a few railroad clerks in stiff vests, a knot of uniformed railroad guards with pistols on their hips and the company's brass badge winking on their chests. Boys craned their necks to see the woman on the platform, some with excited eyes, some looking stubbornly at the ground. Someone cleared his throat. A baby cried and was quickly hushed. A dog trotted to the edge of the gathered people, nose twitching, tail down, feeling the tension that soaked the square. Lena heard all of it through the ring in her ears and the slow, measured thumping of her own heartbeat, each beat a small hammer on the inside of her ribs. They called her Mara Collins. She had answered to that name for years, had signed it on dry goods receipts and on the back of a marriage certificate, had sewn it small and neat into the hem of a Sunday dress once when she was still foolish enough to think life might stay steady. She had not begged when the verdict came down, had not cried when the cell door closed, had not sobbed for the future that was being cut short. Instead, she had sat tall on the narrow bunk and folded her hands in her lap and felt only a cold, puzzled anger that would not quite take shape, as if something inside her knew there was more wrong here than the crime they said she had done. Now, as the hangman checked the knot one last time, fingers rough and bored on the coil of rope above her head, that same anger was there, but it was thinner, wrapped tight with numbness and the strange floating feeling that comes when a person has gone past fear and found only blank space on the other side. The preacher's voice droned, "May God have mercy on your soul," and the hangman moved to the lever, and the sheriff's hand tightened on the rail. Lena's toes gripped the wood until she felt a splinter jab the soft skin under her smallest toe, and she stared straight ahead over the heads of the crowd, not at the judge or the sheriff or the preacher, not at the railroad agent leaning with satisfaction near the rail yard wagon, but at a point beyond them all, where the gray sky met the far hills and a thin line of winter-burned cottonwoods etched the horizon. Somewhere beyond those hills, she thought, there had once been trees thicker than buildings and grass up to a child's waist and water that ran clear and cold, and the thought came to her not like a fantasy but like a memory, heavy and specific, and it startled her so much she almost gasped. "Do you have any last words?" the judge asked, his tone empty of hope, because very few last words changed anything. Lena swallowed around the rope and felt its burn, felt the knot sit hard under her left eye. "No, Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, and if there was a tremor it was from the rope, not from her. The hangman curled his fingers around the lever, ready to drop it and send her into whatever came next, and the preacher lifted his eyes to heaven for the final blessing. Then a voice, sharp and cutting as a whip crack, tore straight through the low murmur of the crowd. "Hold!" It came from the edge of the square, where the crowd thinned toward the livery and the general store, and it was not the shaky plea of a desperate relative or the cracked shout of a drunk. It was flat, certain, and it carried the weight of a man who had used that tone to stop bullets and men and maybe whole days. Heads turned. The hangman froze, his knuckles whitening on the lever. The preacher faltered on the word mercy. The sheriff's hand went at once to his holster and then stopped halfway as he saw who it was that stepped out from between two freight wagons and into full view of the square. He was tall without being towering, built lean, the kind of man who carried no extra weight, his long dark coat open despite the cold, the leather of his gun belt worn and shaped by years of use. His hair was black shot with iron gray at the temples, his jaw dark with stubble, and his eyes were the pale, washed-out blue of high mountain ice, eyes that had watched men die and had not flinched but had not enjoyed it either. At each hip rested a holstered revolver, old but clean, grips smoothed by 1,000 draws. People near him did not simply move aside. They melted out of his way as if their feet had minds of their own, a ripple opening in the crowd that led straight toward the scaffold steps. "Rook," someone whispered, and the name passed from mouth to mouth like a gust of cold air, tightening shoulders as it went. Tales of him had wandered from campfire to campfire and railcar to barroom. Rook with the iron draw, Rook who rode with no brand, Rook who took pay from whoever could afford him and whose ledger was written in powder and lead. Mothers had used his name to frighten children home at dark. Young men had repeated his deeds with shining eyes, half admiration, half terror. Now the legend walked in boot leather across their own square, in broad daylight, towards the gallows the town fathers had built to show that law ruled here and not old wild stories. He climbed 3 of the steps as calm as a man mounting a porch, then stopped when the sheriff found his voice. "That's far enough, Rook," Sheriff Mayfield barked, the sound cracking higher than he might have liked. His badge caught what little light there was, but it looked small suddenly, a button on a worn vest. "This is a lawful execution ordered by the court. You so much as touch that rope, we'll fill you with holes." A few of the braver men in the crowd, and 2 of the railroad guards, tugged rifles higher, barrels lifting towards the scaffold. The outlaw turned his head slowly, taking in the weapons pointed his way, and then returned his gaze to the woman standing on the trapdoor. For a long heartbeat, he simply looked at her, his eyes flicked from the old bruise. Just visible beneath the rope to the small scar near her hairline, half hidden by a loose strand, to the way her toes dug into the wood. Something in his chest, hard as old leather, gave a strange, almost forgotten pull. When he finally spoke again, his words were not for the sheriff or the judge. "That rope is around the wrong woman's neck," he said quietly. But his voice still carried, each syllable clean and sharp as a coin on a wooden counter. "She's no Mara Collins." The judge's head tilted like a bird's. Murmurs rose and fell. Lena felt her breath catch in her chest, not because she recognized him. She did not, but because the way he spoke about her felt like a hand shoved suddenly into still water, staring up things lying heavy at the bottom. "Her name," Rook said, letting the pause stretch until every ear leaned into it, "is Lena Hart." The name hit her like a thrown stone. Lena. It was a simple sound, 2 gentle steps of a word, but it carried weight, came with the faintest scent of smoke and river water and the flash of children running through tall grass. Her knees almost buckled. She stared at him, searching his face for anything familiar and finding only scars and lines she knew nothing about. The square went very quiet. Somewhere a horse blew and stamped, the sound shockingly loud. The judge cleared his throat, more to buy time than from any need to speak. "I don't know what game you think you're playing, Rook," he said, and his voice no longer sounded quite so steady. "But this court has records, sworn testimony, a signed confession, signed with a hand guided by your clerk." Rook cut in, turning his gaze slowly from the woman on the gallows to the bench where the judge sat today. That icy stare landed like a physical weight. "Filed by your railroad friends. You know as well as I do how clean you can make a paper trail when you own the land and the ink." He lifted a hand, palm empty, fingers spread to show he was not reaching for his guns. "I'm not here to shoot anyone. I'm here to call a debt. A debt you wrote yourself, Judge Cole, the night you signed over the Hart Valley to the Consolidated Western Railroad and called it clear of prior claim." He let that old phrase hang in the air. Old men at the back of the crowd shifted uneasily. They remembered rumors of that valley, remembered burnt-out cabins and wagons rolling through town piled high with household goods rescued from ashes. Hart Valley was settled land, Rook went on. Families. A small church. Children. But there's no mention of them in your record books, is there? Just unlawful squatters removed by lawfully deputized men. You called it a bandit camp so you could sleep at night and cash your checks. That's enough, the railroad agent barked, stepping forward, his neat mustache bristling, his company badge shining in righteous anger. This is slander. The woman you're trying to claim is a convicted thief and murderer. Rook's eyes snapped to him. The woman I'm naming, he said, is the child who survived when your hired guns turned that valley into a charred grave. The girl whose father's signature is on the land grant you filed away in your private safe. The only living heart. He shifted his focus back to the judge. And you know damn well, Your Honor, that if she hangs today under a false name, the last person who could stand up in a court and say what really happened in that valley dies with her. Maybe that's what you want. But understand this. If you do, the secret goes into the ground. But so do you. Because I have that grant. A ripple went through the crowd. He had spoken quietly, but the words, I have that grant, tolled through the square like a bell. The sheriff's hand, which had been creeping towards his gun, hesitated. Judge Cole's lips thinned. Beneath the rope, Lena's heart pounded so hard she could feel it in the tips of her fingers. Hart Valley. Grant. Father's signature. Pictures, more feeling than image, swam at the edges of her mind. A broad man with rough hands bending over a table, tongue caught between his teeth as he signed something careful and important. The smell of ink and lamp oil. A woman's laugh in another room. The heat of a fire not confined to a hearth. She swallowed and tasted ash. You have no standing here, the judge said stiffly, clinging to the forms of law like a drowning man to driftwood. You're a wanted criminal. Your word means nothing in this court. Maybe so, Rook agreed, almost mildly. But your name on a stolen land grant means plenty, once I lay it out in front of a territorial marshal. You remember that night, Judge? The drinks after, when your hand shook just enough that you spilled whiskey on the paper and cursed like any man. I remember it. So does the paper. Something flickered in the judge's eyes. Guilt, fear, memory. His fingers tightened on the arm of his chair until the knuckles went white. Sheriff Mayfield glanced sideways at him and then back at Rook, mind racing, weighing bullets against signatures, legends against the company that paid most of the town's wages. Sheriff, Rook said, his tone shifting, turning almost conversational, like a man offering a choice across a poker table. You can pull that lever and hang a woman under a name that isn't Hayes, knowing there's even a chance I'm telling the truth. Or you can cut her down and let me take custody of her as a witness. If I'm lying, you still have enough rifles here to put 3 holes in me before I hit the street. If I'm telling the truth, he let the sentence trail off, let the possibilities float there, dark and heavy. The crowd felt them. Men who had lost homesteads to quiet legal tricks, who had watched the railroad line cut through their grazing land and then been told the company owned it now, shifted closer together, eyes narrowing. Is right about one thing. An old rancher near the front called out, his voice thin but carrying. Judge never did hold a hearing on that valley. Just read some paper and said it was done. We all thought that was fast. Shut your mouth, Ben, the railroad agent snapped, but his voice wavered. You've all benefited from that line. Benefited, the rancher shot back. My cousin's place got cut in 2. He got a handshake and a promise the check was coming. Still waiting. Murmurs swelled. The sheriff's jaw clenched. He looked from the woman on the trapdoor to the judge, to the outlaw whose hands remained empty at his sides, and then finally to the crowd, reading the weather in their faces like a man reading a sky before storm. If he ordered the hangman to pull now, it wouldn't just be one neck breaking on that scaffold. Something between the town and the law would snap too, and he didn't know if he could hold the pieces together. The hangman shifted, the lever still inches from his hand, sweat beading on his brow. Lena stood very still, the rope biting, her mind a whirlpool of half-formed memories and sharp present fear. Lena Hart. The name sat heavy in her chest now, beating like a second heart. Cut her down, the sheriff said finally, the words sounding like they had been dragged out of him with pliers. For now. A loud exhale moved through the crowd, some in relief, some in frustration, some in the tight disappointment of people who had come for spectacle and been denied the neat finality of it. The railroad agent swore under his breath. Judge Cole opened his mouth to object, but the look in the sheriff's eyes stopped him. The hangman, eager to be clear of whatever this was turning into, reached up with shaking hands and worked the knot loose, carefully lifting the noose over Lena's head. The rope left a hot, raw band on her skin. Blood rushed back into her face, making the square sway for a heartbeat. She took a slow, careful breath and felt the cold air claw down into the bottom of her lungs. Rook climbed the last few steps and came to stand beside her, close enough that she could smell leather and trail dust and a faint, dry scent like old paper that clung to his coat. Up close, the scars on his jaw were crisper, pale lines against sun-browned skin. His eyes, even colder this near, searched her face with a strange kind of hunger, not for her body or even her loyalty, but for recognition. "Lena," he said softly, so only she could hear. "You're taller than when I last saw you." "I don't know you," she said, and it was the truth, but the sound of him saying her name made her bones ache as if they had been carrying the wrong weight for years. He nodded once, as if he had expected this, then turned back to the square. "By rights and by risk," he said to the judge, voice carrying again. "I'm claiming custody of this woman as a material witness in a pending matter of land fraud, theft, and murder. If you've got a quarrel with that, Judge Cole, you know where to take it. The territorial office. In writing, along with your copy of that land grant." The judge's mouth moved, but no sound came for a moment. The sheriff, sensing the currents, stepped in. "We'll have a hearing," he said stiffly. "Temporary transfer of custody, pending further investigation. That sound lawful enough to you, Rook?" It was as much of a bridge as he could build between the law he had sworn to save and the situation he actually faced. Rook gave a faint, humorless smile. "Lawful enough," he said. "For now." He put a steadying hand, light as a question, at Lena's elbow. "We're leaving," he murmured. For a heartbeat, she thought about yanking her arm away, about standing right there on that platform and refusing to go anywhere with this stranger who had thrown her life into a new kind of chaos. Every instinct in her, honed by years of keeping her head down and her mouth shut, screamed at her to cling to what routine was left. But the memory of the rope, of the bored hands on the lever, of the way the railroad agent had watched her with the calm interest of a man ticking items off a ledger, rose up sharp. Staying here meant trusting the same people who had almost killed her for something she knew in her bones she had not done. Going with the outlaw meant stepping into unknown air, but the trapdoor beneath her feet had just been proven to be a lie. She let him guide her down the steps. The crowd parted like water. Some looked at her with open curiosity, some with suspicion, some with a distant pity reserved for the recently dead who, for reasons not yet clear, still breathed. A girl in a faded blue dress clutched at her mother's skirt and whispered, "Mama, is she a witch?" The mother shushed her, but her eyes were on the railroad agent, not Lena. Rook's men were waiting at the edge of the square, 3 riders in dust-stained coats and hats pulled low, their horses restless. One had a scar across his nose, another rode with an easy slouch that suggested he could pull and fire a revolver from the saddle faster than most men could blink. They watched their boss and the woman he was leading with expressions somewhere between surprise and wariness, as if this was not how they had expected the morning to go. "We're taking her now," Rook told them, his tone leaving no room for debate. "No shooting unless they shoot first. We're not robbing a bank. We're escorting a witness." The man with the nose scar raised an eyebrow but nodded. Behind them, the sheriff called out, more for the town than for Rook. "You bring her back here, Rook," he said, "if there's to be any further hearing." "You'll see her again," Rook replied without turning. "Question is whether she walks in or hangs." Then they were moving out of the square and down the main street, past the mercantile with its drying sacks of flour in the window and the saloon with its lamplight doorway still smelling of last night's whiskey and sweat. Above the rooftops, the scaffold's dark beam cut a hard line against the gray sky. Lena did not look back. They reached the horses. One of the men swung down and offered her a hand up on a spare mount, a rangy bay with a white blaze and patient eyes. For a moment her legs refused to bend, but then her body remembered the rhythm of stirrup and saddle, the weight of leather under her, and she swung up more easily than she would have believed, skirts bunching. Where did I learn that? Flickered through her mind, sharp and unwelcome. You ride like you were born to it, the scar-nosed man muttered, almost to himself. She ignored him, took the reins, and squinted into the pale light east of town, where the land rolled away in dry, low swells. Rook mounted with the easy, unconscious grace of a man who had spent more time on horseback than on any bed. "Ride," he said. They did. The town fell behind them under a thinning veil of cold dust. As the last building shrank and the open country swallowed them, Lena felt something loosen in her chest that had nothing to do with the rope band on her neck and everything to do with a different kind of tightness, one she hadn't known was there until it eased. The sun fought its way through the clouds, turning the land into a dull, endless palette of browns and grays broken by the occasional thorny bush or stunted tree. Hoofbits thudded rhythmically, a steady drum under the wheeze of saddle leather and the occasional snort from the horses. Rook rode slightly ahead and to her left, his eyes never still, flicking over ridges and gullies, fence lines and draws, reading the land the way a man reads faces. The Noose had left a faint smell of hemp and sweat in her hair. She kept lifting her chin, stretching her neck, as if to prove to herself it was truly gone. After a time, when the town was no more than a smudge behind them, he spoke. "Was there a creek behind your childhood home?" he asked abruptly, eyes still on the horizon. She stiffened. "What?" "A creek," he repeated. "Ran shallow in summer. Rocks in the bed smooth as coins. In spring, overflowed and turned the back pasture to mud. Your ma cursed it every year when the laundry line sagged." The image rose up so fast she could smell wet cotton and hear the creak of rope underweight. A wide, shining ribbon of water, her own bare feet numb from standing in it too long, her hands numb from trying to drag a crooked stick into place as an imaginary fishing pole. Her mother laughing from the bank, apron tied over her dress, calling, "Lena, you'll catch your death in there," and her father's deeper voice joining in. "Let the girl feel the cold. Build sense." She squeezed her eyes shut for a second and then opened them, angry. I don't know what you're talking about," she said. "My father worked for the railroad office. I grew up in a boarding house over the general store in Milford." The lie came out smooth from long use, but it felt thin now, flimsy as cheap cloth. "Is that what they told you?" Rook asked, still mild. "Or is that what you told yourself because it hurt less?" "I remember," she snapped. "I remember the ledgers and the smell of ink and my father's cuff worrying at his wrist when he thought too hard. I remember the trains." "You remember a man," Rook said softly, "who wore a shirt 2 sizes too small and whose handwriting never quite lost the loop of a farm boy. You remember the way he flinched whenever someone from the company with a higher badge walked past his desk. You remember how he died." Her mouth went dry. She had been standing in the narrow hallway outside the little parlor, listening to raised voices through thin boards. A door slammed. Her father had stormed past, his face red, his eyes wild, a slip of paper clenched in his hand. She had watched him shrug into his coat with jerking movements, his fingers missing buttons, and then he was gone, and she had never seen him alive again. The next thing she remembered clearly was the sheriff's polite knock, the bland, sorrowful expression, the words, "Robbery gone wrong. Your husband was found at the rail yards. He must have tried to stop them. Brave to a fault." The paper would surface later, folded neatly in a drawer, the ink smudged where a thumb had pressed too hard. Payroll figures. Signatures. Her father's name right there among them, small and neat and out of place. He was a good man, she said now, more to herself than to Rook. Better than the job they gave him, Rook replied. He didn't belong in a ledger cage. He belonged with his boots in soil he owned. That's why he signed. Signed what? She demanded. But even as she asked the question, another memory pushed upward, relentless. Her father hunched over a different table in a different room, light slanting in through curtains made from a flour sack, his tongue caught between his teeth as he traced out each careful letter. The paper thick and stiff, smelling not just of ink but of something official, something that carried the weight of faraway offices. Her mother's hands on his shoulders, squeezing once in quiet pride. She shook her head, trying to dislodge it. "You're trying to confuse me." "No," he said. "I'm trying to let the truth in before it breaks you on its own. The mind is a cage that locks itself. Lena, sometimes you gotta show it the key." She glared at him. "Stop calling me that." "What should I call you?" he asked calmly. "Mara, a name someone else put on you in a jail ledger." "It's my name," she said stubbornly. "It's the name on my marriage license." For a moment something flickered across his face. Regret, anger, something older and harder to place. "Your husband worked security for the railroad," he said. "You ever wonder why they hired a man with no family and a wife with no past they could trace back more than a handful of years?" "I had a past," she protested. "People knew me. People knew a seamstress who arrived on a wagon with one trunk and a piece of paper from a boarding housekeeper who barely remembered you," he said. "I know the kind of ghost records they build when they want someone to exist just enough to be controllable." Her hands tightened on the reins until the leather bit into her skin. The horse's steady rhythm, the sweep of land, the bright slice of sky, everything felt too sharp now, as if reality itself had been honed during the ride. She thought she could hear water somewhere, faint, a ghost of a sound, though she knew there was no creek near. The more she tried to hold onto the picture of herself as Mara Collins, lawfully married, lawfully tried, the more it slid like sand between her fingers, and under it something else waited, old and bruised and angry. "How do you know any of this?" she demanded. "Why do you care?" Rook's jaw tightened. His eyes went far away for a moment, not onto the land but back into some corner of his memory. "Because once," he said quietly, "I rode with men who carried railroad papers in their saddlebags and called it law. Because once I kicked in a door in a valley you would have called home, and I was supposed to shoot whoever I found inside, and I didn't. Because a little girl with your eyes ran past me out the back while I fired over her head and hoped to hell she was fast enough. Because later, when the smoke cleared and they said, 'No survivors,' I didn't go back to check. I let them bury that valley with ink and lies. I took their blood money and spent it. That's on me." He glanced at her, at the confusion and dawning horror on her face. "So when I saw you years later at a distance, walking into a church with your hair pinned up and a new name stitched on your dress, I thought maybe I was seeing ghosts. And when your husband turned up in a report as killed during a robbery that sounded a little too neat, I knew the past wasn't done with us. It was just changing tactics." His words lay between them like stones. She stared at him, trying to fit this stranger into the jagged holes in her memories. Flashes came, a dark shape in a doorway, the thunder of boots, her mother's scream cut off too quickly, hands shoving her toward the back. "Run, Lena, run." And then a man's voice roaring, but not the cruel, laughing roar of the others, more like a curse against himself, and bullets punching splinters out of the doorframe above her head as she stumbled into cold night air. She had never remembered those shots as warning shots before. She had never let herself look closely enough. Her stomach lurched. She pulled her horse up short so suddenly the animal tossed its head, snorting. The others reined in, hands going automatically to guns, thinking of ambush, but there was no one there on the empty plain but wind and old ghosts. "If this is true," she said slowly, each word tasting of rust, if I was that child, then why didn't you come find me sooner? Why let me stand up there with that rope on my neck before opening your mouth?" Rook took the question like a blow, his head dipping for the first time. "Because I didn't know for certain," he said. "Because men like me always think we have more time than we do. I heard about the trial late. Rode hard, but not hard enough. By the time I reached Red Hollow, your sentence was set. I walked into town this morning expecting to see a corpse. Instead, I saw you breathing." He met her gaze straight on, letting her see the raw thing behind his legend. "That's my shame. I came late, but I came." She looked away, blinking hard. The land stretched ahead of them, and somewhere beyond, hidden in folds and shadows. She knew there were men riding after them now. Railroad guards, hired guns, maybe even a deputy or two who preferred steady wages to uneasy truth. The road behind her had been cut off with a rope. The road ahead was lined with rifles. "Where are you taking me?" she asked. "To a place they don't know yet," he said. "My camp. There's something there you need to see. After that," he shrugged one shoulder. "After that, we decide whether to run or to turn around and burn their lives on their own doorstep." The idea of going back to Red Hollow made her throat tighten, but the idea of running forever in the shadow of someone else's false name made something inside her roar in silent protest. "I'm not running," she said before she had time to think about it. "Not anymore." He gave a small nod, as if that answer had been exactly what he needed to hear. "Then we'd better make sure the truth you speak stands up in daylight," he said, "because they'll do everything they can to shove it back into the dark." They rode on. The sun climbed, then sagged westward. At midday, they stopped in the lee of a low rise to water the horses at a shallow, muddy pool. As she cupped the gritty water in her hands, she watched Rook move among his men, speaking low, checking cinches and watching the horizon. He moved with a kind of quiet authority that had nothing to do with badges or desks. The men listened, not with the stiff deference of employees, but with the wary respect of companions who knew what he was capable of and had chosen to follow anyway. When they mounted again, the land began to change, the flatness giving way to a series of broken ridges and shallow gullies. Somewhere a bird of prey screamed, circling on a lonely updraft. As afternoon slid toward evening, the air grew cooler. Thin clouds streaked the sky pink and gold. "Almost there," Rook said over his shoulder, guiding them toward a narrow notch between two stone outcroppings that looked, from a distance, like the broken teeth of some enormous jaw. They passed through the gap, hooves ringing softly on stone, and the land opened up suddenly into a bowl-shaped canyon, hidden from the world until you were almost on top of it. A thin ribbon of a stream cut across the center, its banks dotted with scrub, a handful of tents and rough lean-tos clustered near a clump of cottonwoods. A few horses lifted their heads from the sparse grass to watch the newcomers. Smoke from a small cook fire drifted lazily upward. This was no grand outlaw fortress, no luxurious hideaway from dime novel fantasies. It was a place to sleep, to mend tack, to count coins by firelight and decide which roads to take next. It smelled of coffee, sweat, old leather, and gun oil. As they rode in, a man with a thick beard and a rifle across his arms looked up sharply from where he'd been whittling. "You brought company," he said, tone flat. His eyes flicked to Lena, taking in the rope mark on her neck, the bruises on her wrists. "That gonna be a problem?" "She's the reason we're not all just ghosts," Rook replied. "She stays." A few of the men exchanged glances. One, a younger fellow with a crooked grin and hopeful eyes that hadn't yet been beaten all the way down, opened his mouth to say something, then shut it when Rook's gaze passed over him. No one offered Lena a hand down this time, but she slid from the saddle on her own and stood straight, refusing to let her legs show their ache. The ground in the canyon felt different from the town square, less solid and yet more honest. If a man shot you here, it would be because he chose to, not because a piece of paper said he could. Rook gestured toward a flat-topped rock near the fire. "Sit," he said. "Eat something. Then we talk." She almost refused out of sheer contrariness, but her stomach twisted at the smell of beans and meat, and the day had been long. She lowered herself onto the rock. Someone handed her a tin cup of coffee, bitter and thin but hot, and a plate with a scoop of beans and a chunk of bread. She ate mechanically at first, then with growing hunger, realizing only now how little she'd managed to swallow over the last few days in jail. As night pressed into the canyon, shadows pooling at its edges, the men drifted to their usual places. A few took first watch up on the rim. The rest huddled closer to the fire. Rook sat across from her, his face carved by the shifting light, making his eyes look deeper, older. Finally, when the plates had been stacked and the coffee pot emptied, he reached into his coat. He pulled out a folded packet, edges frayed, the once white paper now the color of old bone. He handled it carefully, not like a man handling loot, but like someone lifting a fragile piece of himself. This, he said quietly, is why I walked into Red Hollow this morning instead of riding on. This is why some very powerful men would sleep easier if your neck had snapped. He passed it to her. The paper was cool and unexpectedly heavy in her hands. Her fingers shook slightly as she unfolded it, smoothing the creases. At first the words blurred in the firelight. She blinked, focusing. At the top, in printed letters, it read, Grant of Homestead, Hart Valley, Territory of. Her eyes dropped. There, in Scaffold, looping script, was a name she had not seen in that form in many years. Thomas Hart. Beneath it, in a different hand, was the signature of a territorial clerk. Further down, in a space meant for witnesses, were 3 names, Harlan Cole, Sheriff Jonas Mayfield, and, in a sharp, almost aggressive scrawl, the alias of the man sitting across from her. Below it all, in darker ink, as if the pen had been filled again, someone had stamped, transferred to Consolidated Western Railroad, all prior claims extinguished. The ink had bloomed slightly around the words, as if the paper itself had recoiled. Lena stared at her father's name until it swam. She saw his hands again, rough and careful, filling each letter with the weight of dreams he hadn't allowed himself for years. Land, a place that would belong to them. A valley with a creek and a low hill perfect for a house and a patch of flat ground for corn. She saw the small smile that had trembled at the corner of his mouth when he had lifted her onto his lap and put the pen in her fingers so she could add a little squiggle of an L in the corner. You put your mark there, little Lena, he had said. So this place knows you too. Taze, hot and sudden, burned her eyes. Why does it say transferred? She whispered. He never would have sold. He didn't, Rook said. Not willingly. They sent word that the paperwork had to be amended, that there had been a mistake in the filing. Told him to come into town to sign the correction. What he signed was surrender. And you? She asked, voice shaking. Where were you? He held her gaze, letting the firelight show every crack in his. I was standing in that room, he said, gun on my hip, hat in my hand, watching your father press his name down, thinking of how much the railroad paid for clean lines, not dirty work. I'd already done that part out in the valley. Paper was just the grave marker. Her stomach lurched. She tightened her grip on the paper so hard it crinkled. You killed them, she said, each word heavy. No, he said, and there was iron in his denial. I kicked in the door, same as the others. I saw your ma reach for a shotgun and I shot the ceiling instead. I told her to run. I told you to run. I fired high while you stumbled past me. But in the other cabins, other men weren't so selective. And I didn't stop them. I told myself I couldn't fight them all and live. Told myself you and your ma had gotten clear. Told myself a lot of things so I could sleep with a heavier purse. But I didn't check. I didn't go back when the smoke cleared. That sin is mine. His eyes dropped to the paper. I kept this because I thought maybe, someday, I could hand it to someone who deserved to hold it. Didn't know if that someone was dead or not. Then I saw you. The night pressed close around them, the fire a small island of light in a sea of dark. The men nearby had grown quiet, listening without pretending not to. The wind hissed softly through the cottonwoods, making their bare branches rattle. Lena looked down at her father's name, at the judges, at the sheriffs, at Rook's, all bound together in one ugly knot. You were part of it, she said. Part of the reason I ended up nowhere, living under someone else's name with pieces of memory knocked loose like boards in a storm. You're the reason I had to call a man father who never once looked me in the eye without seeing a ledger behind me. He flinched, just a little. Yes, he said. I was. And now you want to be what? She asked harshly. My savior. My what? Just because your conscience got loud. The men around the fire shifted, discomfort moving through them. Rook held her anger like he held a pistol, steady, accepting its recoil. I don't want to be anything you don't choose, he said. I want to make sure the men who used me and used your father and used you don't get to write the last line. That's all. If you never see me again after that, that's fine. My ledger with you won't be clean. Nothing makes it clean, but it might stop it getting blacker. She laughed once, a hard, small sound. You talk like some preacher, she said. only with more blood on your hands. Preachers talk about forgiveness, he said. I'm talking about consequences. She looked at him for a long time, feeling something inside her tilt, slow and massive, like a boulder shifting after years of stillness. He was right about one thing. Regardless of what he had done, the names on this paper were the same names printed on her trial documents, on the pay orders that had gone missing from the railroad safe, on the reports that said robbery where they should have said cover-up. The same people who had taken her valley, her parents, her name, had then taken her husband and tried to take her life to make sure the story stayed neat. Rage, clean and cold, rose up in her, burning away some of the fog. It wasn't the wild, flailing anger of a victim. It was the focused fury of someone finally shown where the blade had come from. They'll come after us, she said quietly, smoothing the paper, folding it very carefully along its old creases. Her fingers no longer shook. They won't let this stand. They are probably already writing, Rook agreed. Once their man in town wires ahead or doesn't report in, they'll know something went wrong. Question is, what do you want to do about it? She stayed into the fire. For a moment she saw, instead of flames, the scaffold beam, the rope swinging slightly in a cold wind, an empty noose waiting. She saw herself standing beneath it, head bowed, hands tied, and realized that whether she lived or died, if she did nothing, she would still be under that rope, their story, forever. We go back, she said. Rook's eyebrows rose slightly. That's one option, he said. The other is we take this paper and find a marshal in a bigger town, one not in their pocket. Let him do the slow work. Slow work, she repeated, tasting the words. While they burn this canyon and call it another outlaw raid. While they find someone else to hang. Maybe a girl who looks like me but isn't. She shook her head. No, they almost got away with it because they did it quiet, in rooms, on paper. You said yourself, they buried the valley with ink. They need light. Her eyes lifted to his. In them now was something that hadn't been there that morning on the trapdoor. Purpose. You asked me if I remembered a scaffold, she said. I will. I remember how still people went, how they leaned in, how they believed every word the judge read because it sounded official and it was spoken from higher than them. That same place can be used for something else. Rook was very still. You go back there, he said slowly. You stand on that wood again. You talk with your own neck in rifle sights. You know that, don't you? My neck was in their rope this morning, she said. At least this way. If I choke, it's on words I chose. Silence settled for a moment except for the crackle of burning wood and the far-off howl of some desert animal. Then one of Rook's men, the young one with the crooked grin, exhaled in a soft, admiring gust. She's got more sand than all of us put together, he muttered. Shut up, Joey, the bearded man beside him said, but there was no heat in it. Rook looked at Lena with a kind of reluctant respect, maybe even a sliver of something like pride that he quickly smothered. If we go back, he said, we don't stroll in smiling. They'll have rifles in the windows, men on the roofs, agents in the shadows. You stand on that platform and start speaking names. Someone's going to try to cut you off. With lead. Then you make sure they miss, she replied, or that the town sees who's pulling the trigger. He stared at her for another long heartbeat, then nodded, decision settling on his shoulders like a familiar coat. All right, he said. At dawn we ride. We get there before they've fully decided whether to call it a riot or parade. We present your evidence in the only court they can't ignore, their own curiosity. He glanced at his men. You hear that, boys? We're taking an accused bandit's whore. The ugly phrase rolled bitter off his tongue, echoing things he'd heard whispered in saloons, and putting her back where they tried to hang her, only this time she's holding the noose. Feels like we're daring the whole territory to shoot at us, the bearded man grumbled. We are, Rook said, but we're also daring them to listen. That night Lena slept little. When she did drift off, her dreams were a jumble. The creak behind the valley house, the scrape of boots in the dark, the court clerk's droning voice reading charges, the hollow thud of the trapdoor under other feet, her own included. Each time she started awake, heart pounding, the folded land grant under her pallet crackled faintly, a small, stubborn reminder that she was not imagining any of it. Dawn came thin and brittle. They saddled in silence. Rook's men checked rifles, counted cartridges, adjusted straps. Lena slipped the folded paper into the inner pocket of her dress, close to her skin. She tied her hair back in a way that felt old and new at once, practical for riding, the way her mother had taught her long ago when they had still had chores that involved animals and not just thread. As she swung into the saddle, her muscles ached, but there was strength in the ache. The ride back felt shorter and longer at once. The land rose and fell. The wind had a knife edge. By the time Red Hollow came into sight again, smoke from morning cook fires curling into the sky, the scaffold's beam was visible over the rooftops like a finger pointing right at them. "They've posted lookouts," Rook noted, his eyes picking out small movements on the edge of town. "Good. Saves us the trouble of announcing ourselves. Once we ride in, there's no turning back." "I'm not turning back," Lena said. The square was less crowded than it had been at the hanging, but news of their approach spread like fire on dry grass. By the time they reached the main street, people were already stepping out of doorways, wiping flour off hands, pushing hats back on heads, calling to neighbors. Rook and his men rode in slowly, neither skulking nor charging, their pace saying, "We are not sneaking and we are not attacking. We are coming as something else." The something else did not yet have a name. Sheriff Mayfield emerged from his office, jaw dark with stubble, eyes tired and wary. Two deputies flanked him, hands hovering near holsters. Up on the courthouse steps, Judge Cole stood stiff in his coat, face paler than usual. The railroad agent was there too, flanked by two of his guards, their uniforms neat, their eyes hard and nervous. "You took your time coming back," the sheriff said grimly. "Thought maybe you'd run for the border." "I'll cross a border soon enough," Rook replied, "but not until this is done." He turned his head slightly. "Lena." Her stomach fluttered, but she slid down from the saddle before it could tane into a tremor. She felt the weight of eyes on her, the murmur of recognition. That's her, the one they almost hung. Why is she back? She walked through the crowd alone, Rook and his men hanging back with their horses, forming a loose, unspoken guard. No one reached out to stop her. Curiosity held them like a net. The steps to the scaffold felt steeper today, each one a small act of will. Her fingers brushed the rail where she had steadied herself yesterday with bound hands. The rope had been removed for now, coiled near the railing like a sleeping snake. It might be hung again. The thought made her spine stiffen. She moved past it and stepped once more onto the trapdoor. But this time her hands were free, and she turned to face the town of her own will, not because someone had forced her chin up. The square fell into a hush. Even the wind seemed to wait. "Yesterday," she began, and her voice shook just enough that she stopped, swallowed, and tried again. "Yesterday you nearly watched me die." No one moved. A baby fussed and was bounced into silence. "You were told my name was Mara Collins," she went on, "and that I had robbed a payroll and helped kill a deputy marshal. You trusted the records. You trusted the men who keep them. Why wouldn't you? That's what towns do. That's what law is supposed to be." Her eyes went to the judge, then to the sheriff, then to the railroad agent. "I thought my name was Mara too," she said. "Because that's the name they put on my papers when I was taken in after a raid. Because that's the name I was told to answer to. It was easier to accept the story they handed me than to look at the gaps and ask why they were there. They tell you they are saving you from your past. Really, they are burying it, till you're nothing but a shadow stitched into their bookkeeping." A ripple of unease moved through the crowd. Some didn't understand what she meant. Others, people with their own small erasures and compromises tucked away, understood too well. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the folded paper. "My name," she said, and now her voice rose, gaining strength, "is Lena Hart." The sound of it, spoken full and clear in front of witnesses, seemed to crack something in the air. "My father was Thomas Hart. He signed his name on a grant that gave him and his family a valley, a place some of you rode through, maybe, before it went up in smoke." She unfolded the paper with deliberate care, letting them see it was not blank, not a trick. "This," she said, holding it up so the light caught the faded ink, "is the paper that proves it. And this," she added, tapping the line of signatures beneath, is the proof of who took it from him. She began to read, each name like driving a nail into a coffin. Thomas Hart, claimant, she said. Witnessed by Harlan Cole, Jonas Mayfield. And she hesitated, then spoke the alias Rook had used in those days, feeling the man himself flinch down below. One Mr. Rook. A low gasp met the judge's name, the sheriff's. Mayfield's face flushed a splotchy red. I signed as witness to the grant, he called, trying to keep the desperation out of his voice. That don't mean, then why? Lena cut in. Does the bottom of this paper read transferred to Consolidated Western Railroad, all prior claims extinguished? Why does it bear second set of ink, darker, heavier, that my father never saw? She turned the document so the nearest people could see. A man from the back crowded forward, squinting. She's right, he muttered. 2 different pens, 2 different hands. This means nothing, the railroad agent said sharply, stepping forward. Old paper. Could be forged. Could be matched. Rook's voice came, lazy and deadly from where he leaned against a post. To the copy you keep in your safe. Or to the one the railroad office filed in the Capitol. Paper leaves trails. You should know that. The agent's mouth snapped shut. The raid on Hart Valley, Lena said, forcing herself to speak the words, wasn't lawmen removing criminals. It was hired guns clearing off homesteaders whose land had become valuable once the surveyors found a route. They called it a bandit camp so no one would ask why the bodies included women and children. They wrote that no one survived. They were wrong. She drew a breath that felt like pulling air through glass. I survived. Murmurs rose, louder now. A woman near the front, hair gone all gray, put a hand to her mouth. Lord above, she whispered, I remember that night. Fire on the horizon like the sky was burning. My husband said, railroad trouble, and shut the door. From the corner of Hey I, Lena saw movement on a rooftop, a flash of metal catching light. For a moment she thought it was just a chimney cap, but then Rook's head snapped up, his body going taut. He was already moving by the time the glint shifted into the unmistakable angle of a rifle aimed down. Time seemed to slow, stretching like taffy. She saw the long barrel, the shadowed shape behind it. She heard the faint click of a hammer. Somewhere a child laughed, unaware. Rook pushed off the post, his boots striking dirt hard. Down, he roared. He exploded into motion, shoving his way through the thin fringe of the crowd that had formed around the scaffold, his hand going not to his guns but to the space between the assassin's line of sight and Lena's body. The rifle cracked. Sound shattered the square. A hot punch slammed into Rook's shoulder, spinning him sideways, blood bursting out in a dark spray. He staggered but did not fall. His right hand flashed down, drawn by long habit, and his pistol roared in answer, the bullet slamming not into the man on the roof but into the church bells mounting just above his head. The bell gave a wild, broken clang and tore free of its moorings, crashing down onto the porch roof below, collapsing rotten boards and sending the would-be assassin tumbling in a tangle of limbs and splintered wood. Screams erupted. People dove for cover. Dust and splinters exploded across the front of the church. The assassin tried to scramble up, clutching at his rifle, but Dewey, the young outlaw, was already there, having moved like a shadow through the chaos. He kicked the weapon out of the man's hands and brought his own pistol to bear, the barrel inches from the guard's face. Don't, he said, eyes gone flat. The guard froze, hands lifting. His hat had been knocked off in the fall, revealing the company insignia stamped into the band. On his shoulder, under the torn fabric of his coat, a patch with the railroad's emblem glinted. The crowd saw it. "Is not from the sheriff," someone shouted. "Is one of theirs." All at once the chaos shifted. The panic of gunfire shivered into something sharper, anger. Men who had flung themselves behind barrels now peered out with narrowed eyes, seeing not an outlaw starting trouble, but a railroad gunman who had just put a bullet into someone between them and a woman holding a legal document. Hands grabbed at the assassin, yanking him down the rest of the way, dragging him into the square. A fist drove into his gut. He doubled over, gasping. Rook, bleeding but upright, pressed his free hand to his shoulder. Blood seeped between his fingers, staining his coat. But his eyes were on Lena. "Finish," he rasped. "Don't stop." Her legs wanted to tremble, but she locked her knees. She held the land grant high where as many as possible could see it. Her voice cut through the ringing in ears, riding the space carved by gunfire. "You just saw a railroad gunman try to kill me," she said, each word clear as glass. "Right here, in public, while I read a legal document that has their name on it. Ask yourselves why." The assassin, pinned by Joey and two townsmen gripping his arms, sneered. "You a convicted criminal," he spat. "Just cleaning up the company's mess." "The company's mess?" a butcher called out from near his shop, wiping bloody hands on his apron. "Or yours?" He seized the guard's jacket and yanked it open. Payroll chits spilled out, a leather roll of vouchers stamped with a railroad's mark. "He didn't come here as a private citizen," the butcher said, holding the chits high. "He came paid." Judge Cole found his voice finally. "This is outrageous," he said, but less thunderously than he might have hoped. "This is mob justice. Sheriff, arrest these men, all of them. We'll sort this out. You'll sort it out the same way you sorted out Hart Valley," Lena demanded from the scaffold. In the dark, with no one watching. She shook the grant again. "No more dark. No more closed doors. If there is going to be justice today, it's going to have eyes on it." People nodded, murmuring agreement. Some who had always thought of themselves as law-abiding citizens found, to their surprise, that the idea of a hearing right here, right now, in front of their neighbors, sat better in their chest than the idea of trusting everything to the judge's chambers. Sheriff Mayfield's gaze flicked between the judge, the railroad agent, the bleeding outlaw, the furious crowd, and the woman on the scaffold. He saw where the weight had shifted. He took a slow breath. "All right," he said, and his voice carried the gravel of a man who had spent too many nights staring at ceilings, wondering when exactly he had started looking the other way. "We'll have ourselves a different kind of hearing." He stepped into the middle of the square, palm up to the crowd. Everyone settle. Slowly, the noise dropped a notch. "We're not a mob," he continued. "We're a town. We've been asked to trust the law and the railroad both. Today we see which one deserves it." He turned, deliberately, to Lena. "You claim this paper is real," he said. "You claim you're the child who survived Hart Valley. You claim men of this town helped steal your land and bury the truth. You willing to swear to that in front of all present?" Lena's throat felt tight, but her answer came without hesitation. "I am," she said. "On my life, which they tried to take yesterday, and on the memories they tried to bane out of me." "And you?" the sheriff said, turning to the assassin. "Who sent you to that rooftop?" The guard spat on the ground, lips curling. "No comment." Joey shoved his head forward a little with the barrel of his gun. "You might want to think hard," he murmured. "These folks ain't in a patient mood." The guard's eyes darted to the railroad agent. "He'll deny it," he muttered. "They always do. They'll say I acted alone, that I panicked." "Did you?" Lena asked sharply from above. "Did you, seeing a woman reading a piece of paper, panic so badly you decided to shoot her? Or did someone tell you she was a threat to their profit?" He glared up at her, then at the crowd. His jaw worked. Sweat trickled down his temple. The railroad agent, seeing the tide turning dangerously, stepped back, raising his hands. "Now, let's not give credence to wild accusations," he said. "This man will face company discipline. He'll face our discipline first," the butcher snapped. He fired an hour square. "Take them," someone else yelled. Hands grabbed at the agent, the guard, pulling them into the open center of the square. Judge Cole started down the steps as if to intervene, but Sheriff Mayfield held up a hand. For the first time in a long time, the sheriff badge seemed to have some weight behind it, grounded not in paperwork but in the people he stood among. "No one lynches anyone today," he said firmly. "Not on my watch. Not railroad. Not outlaw. Not witness. But we are going to get some answers." He looked up at Lena. "You started this," he said. "Finish telling it. Then we'll decide what to do with the ones who don't like the story." Her knees felt weak, but the scaffold under her feet felt solid in a way it hadn't before. This was no longer just a killing stage. It was a place where words could balance against bullets. She spoke of Hart Valley as she remembered it now that the dam had cracked. The smell of fresh-cut boards when they built the cabin. The way her father had stood in the doorway at dusk, pipe in hand, looking over his land with a quiet, unbelieving joy. The little church where they had sung too loud and off-key but with hearts so full it didn't matter. She spoke of the night the riders came. Faces half-hidden, torches turning the world to wild shadows, a voice barking orders that did not sound like any lawman she'd ever heard. The way her mother had shoved her toward the back, the feel of her father's shirt under her gripping fingers as she tried to pull him with her. She told of the doorway and the tall man in it, gun in hand, whose shots had cut splinters above her head instead of cutting her down, whose shout of "run" had followed her into the cold. She described waking later under strange sheets, smoke in her lungs, a kind voice calling her Mara. She told of the rail town, the boarding house, the way people handled her gently, like someone made of glass filled with old, sharp things best not examined too closely. She told of meeting the man who would become her husband, a quiet guard whose kindness had a haunted edge, as if he knew he was turning keys in doors other men had locked with blood. She spoke of his death, of the way the sheriff's words hadn't matched the lines of worry on his face when he brought the news, of the way the trial had felt more like a play whose script everyone already knew. As she spoke, faces in the crowd changed. People who had heard bandits and thought of faceless threats now saw cabins and children. People who had shrugged at company business now saw how easily that phrase could cover anything. When she was done, the square hummed with low, fierce sound. Then Rook, still holding his bleeding shoulder, stepped forward when Sheriff Mayfield jerked his chin at him. "Your time," the sheriff said. "You were one of the ones who rode into that valley. Your name's on that paper. You willing to own what you did?" Rook could have run. His horse stood not far away. In the confusion, a lesser man might have slipped into an alley, vanished with the legend intact and the mess left behind. Instead, he squared his shoulders, gritted his teeth against the pain, and spoke in a voice roughened by gun smoke and too many bad choices. He told them about the job offer, the fat envelope of cash put on a table not by a drunk rancher but by a neat clerk with a company's seal, how bandit trouble had sounded almost righteous at the time. He described the ride-in, the way the valley had glowed in lamplight, not like a den of thieves but like any other scattered settlement. He described the moment at that door, the woman and child, the decision he'd made with his gun and the decisions he hadn't had the guts to make afterward. He spoke of the land grant signing, of the judge's glassy eyes, of the sheriff's rigid jaw, of his own silent complicity. "They paid me," he said simply at the end. "Can't pretend otherwise. They paid me to help them steal land and lives. I can't give most of that back. I can make damn sure they don't sit pretty on it while she swings." When he fell silent, the air in the square felt thick. The judge's lips were pressed so tight they had almost disappeared. The railroad agent looked as if he might be sick. Sheriff Mayfield scrubbed a hand over his face. "All right," he said hoarsely. "That's enough talk. Time for decisions." He turned to the crowd, something in him hardening. "You all know me," he said. "You know I've worn this badge for 15 years. You know I've made arrests I'm proud of and looked away from some things I ain't. That's on me. But what I won't do anymore is pretend the railroad's word is the same as the law's. Today proved it ain't." He gestured at the judge. "You, Judge, sign that paper. Maybe you thought you were doing right by progress. Maybe you told yourself if you didn't, someone worse would. Maybe you just like the look of the check. Doesn't matter. You let your office be used to steal a valley and bury the bodies under words." He nodded at the railroad agent. "You and yours, you've been strutting around here like you own the air we breathe. Maybe you own some land. You don't own people." He looked back at Lena, at the grant in her hand. "By the power vested in me as Sheriff of Red Hollow," he said, voice steady now, "I'm placing Judge Cole, Railroad Agent Willis, and this company gun under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder and for fraudulent taking of land. They'll be held in our own cells, not the company's, until a territorial marshal can come hear this tale with his own ears and see that paper with his own eyes." Judge Cole sputtered. "You can't arrest me, Mayfield," he snapped. "You don't have the authority." "Seems I do," Mayfield replied. "Badge says law." not railroad. And the people here seem to back me. He nodded at the crowd. Angry voices rose in agreement. A few men stepped forward to help the deputies, who suddenly found they had more volunteers than they needed. Cole, Willis, and the assassin were dragged, protesting, toward the jail, not roughly but with no more politeness than the law afforded any other suspect. As they passed, Lena met the judge's eyes. For a second she saw not a powerful man but a tired one, trapped in the web he had helped spin, unable now to pull free without tearing himself apart. There was no satisfaction in it, only a grim kind of balance. The square slowly calmed. People drifted into small knots, talking in low, intense tones, the kind people use when they know they will be retelling this day for the rest of their lives. Children stayed wide-eyed at Lena, at Rook, at the bare beam of the scaffold. Sheriff Mayfield climbed the steps halfway, until he stood level with Lena's waist. As for you, he said, louder now, so others could hear, the conviction for payroll robbery and murder is hereby stayed. Officially, until a higher court can review it in light of this new evidence. Stayed, someone echoed. Why not thrown out? Because that's not my rope to cut, he replied. Territorial court's job. But I'm damned if I'll be party to hanging someone whose whole life's been turned into a lie on paper. He looked at Lena, his eyes tired but clear. You can stay in town under guard, or you can leave with whoever you like. I won't stop you either way. But know this, if you run, they'll say it proves your guilt. If you stay, he shrugged, it'll be harder, but it might be the only way to really scrape their story off your name. She thought about the canyon, the possible safety of it, the way the wind had sounded different there. Then she thought about Hart Valley, about the creek, about the graves that had never been marked, only covered by new grass and indifference. I'm not running, she said again, more quietly this time but with no less conviction. Not for my own name, not for my father's. Then you'll need a place to sleep that ain't a cell, the sheriff said. We'll figure that out. He glanced at Rook. And you're wanted 6 ways from Sunday. I should chain you to a post right now. You could, Rook agreed. The blood on his shoulder had slowed, but not stopped. His face was pale under the stubble. But then the only man who can testify about Hart Valley from the other side of the barrel will be sitting behind bars when the marshal rides in. Mayfield grimaced. Damn you for being right. He sighed. All right. Here's the deal. You go with the marshal when he comes. You tell him what you told us. You hand him that grant. In return, I'll put in a word that might just keep you from a rope of your own. Maybe. That's more than I expected, Rook said. I'm used to folks wanting me dead, not debriefed. Don't get comfortable, the sheriff growled. You're not a hero here. You're a witness who happened to grow a conscience. Rook's mouth twisted in something that might have been the ghost of a smile. Story of my life, he said. Lena looked at him, at the blood on his shirt, at the lines on his face carved by choices he couldn't undo. You'll go with them, she asked. You'll stand in a courtroom and say all this again. Seems only fair, he said. I helped start this with a gun. I can help end it with my mouth. She huffed a laugh at that, surprised by it. The scaffold felt less like a gallows now and more like a strange, rough sort of pulpit. She stepped down slowly. The rope brushed her shoulder, a faint, itchy touch. Without quite thinking about it, she reached up, grabbed the coarse hemp coil, and lifted it off the beam. It was heavier than it looked. She held it up for the square to see. This doesn't belong up here anymore, she said. Not until you're sure it's only falling on the right necks. A murmur of agreement rolled through the crowd. A man from the livery, broad-shouldered, arms roped with muscle, stepped forward. Hey, he said, taking the coil from her. We'll store it. Maybe let it rot a little before we hang anyone else. Or never, someone else said. Wouldn't break my heart. As the square slowly emptied, as people drifted back to their lives carrying fresh anger and a new, wary watchfulness toward the men in fine coats, Lena stood at the edge of the platform, looking past the buildings toward where she knew Hart Valley lay, over low hills and under that same wide sky. The land grant in her pocket was not magic. It wouldn't raise the dead. It wouldn't rebuild cabins or unburn crops. But it was a line, black on white, that said, We were here. We existed. We mattered. She felt a presence at her side. Rook stood there, swaying just slightly on his feet, his wounded shoulder bandaged hastily by the town's doctor. You didn't have to come back, she said quietly. Could have ridden on and let me twist. Could have, he agreed. But I'm tired of riding away from the fires I helped start. Besides, he glanced at the beam. If they'd hung you yesterday, I'd have spent the rest of my sorry life hearing the crack of that trap in my dreams. I already got enough ghosts. She studied him. This doesn't fix it, she said. Not what happened in the valley. Not what you did. I know, he said. Some things don't get fixed. They just get faced. A wagon rattled past, carrying Judge Cole, the agent, and the guard toward the jail. Their heads were bowed. People watched from doorways, eyes narrowed. The wind picked up, flapping a loose shutter, lifting dust. When the marshal comes, she said, they'll ask me if I want to press charges or just let the territory handle it. They'll talk about settlements and restitution and all the words men use when they're trying to turn wrong into paperwork. What will you say? Rook asked. She looked toward the distant hills again. I'll say my father wanted land, not money, she said. I'll say if they want to make it right, they can start by giving Hart Valley back its name. Put it on maps again. Let people know what happened there. Maybe let some families settle it who ain't afraid of ghosts. She turned back to him. And I'll say if they want a statement about that raid, they can get it from the man who pulled the trigger and didn't finish the job. You're cruel, he said, but there was a glint of something like respect under it, making me live long enough to testify instead of letting me die easy. Easy, she echoed, glancing at his bloody bandage. That shoulder doesn't look easy. He shrugged, winced. I've had worse, he said. Besides, dying in a blaze of gunfire is the kind of ending men like me dream of when they're young and stupid. Living long enough to sit in a witness chair and admit every rotten thing you did. That's harder. Maybe that's the punishment I got coming. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the town adjust to its new reality. Children were already playing again at the edge of the square, their game incorporating the fallen bell, their shouts bright. Life, stubborn and indifferent, moved forward. So what now? He asked. Now I find somewhere to sleep that isn't a cell, she said. And tomorrow, and the day after, I keep telling this story until it sticks. Until my name, my real name, isn't something an outlaw has to shout from the edge of a crowd to keep me from swinging. You'll have help, he said. Sheriff's got more backbone than I thought. Some of these folks do too. He paused. And if you ever need someone to stand behind you looking mean while you speak, well, I'm out of other jobs for a while. She gave him a long, measuring look. Maybe, she said slowly, when this is done, when the marshal has had his say and the railroad has swallowed the bitter taste of losing, you might ride out to that valley. See what's left. Why? He asked. So the bones can tell me they hate me to my face instead of in my sleep. So you can see it's more than what you burned, she replied. Land remembers more than fire. Maybe you can help build something instead of just guarding it or taking it. He snorted softly. You planning on going back? I don't know, she admitted. Maybe I'll stand where our cabin once was and see if I feel anything at all. Maybe I'll plant something there. Or maybe I'll just say my parents' names out loud and let the wind carry them. But I do know this much. I won't go back there as Mara Collins, the seamstress who hanged. I'll go as Lena Hart. The way she said it now made the name feel like a stake driven into solid ground. He nodded once. That's worth riding for, he said. When the time comes. For now. They turned away from the scaffold together, him limping just a little, her neck ringed with a fading bruise that would take time to disappear. Behind them, the wooden structure stood bare, no noose hanging from its beam, just a dark, empty space where a rope had once dangled, where a life had almost ended, where a story had begun instead, not written in the careful hand of clocks but in the rough, uneven script of people who had finally decided to speak. And though there would be trials and paperwork and arguments and quiet threats still to come, though the railroad would not give up its power without a fight and the law would move in its slow, grinding way, one thing in Red Hollow had already changed in a way that could not be completely undone. A woman who had been told her whole life who she was and what she had done had stood on the same boards meant for her death and told the town her own name, her own past, her own truth. The echo of that choice would carry farther than the sound of any dropped trapdoor, rolling out over the dry hills toward a valley that, for the first time in a long time, had a chance of being called by its real name again.